thank you all for coming. My name is Mirette Mabrouk. I am the Deputy Director for Regional Programs at the Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council. Now, the Hariri Center was set up to study the Arab countries in transition after the Arab uprisings. And this event was sort of springboarded from two reports that we've written. The reports are available. I do encourage you to read them. One is on the economic consequences of the Arab Spring, which was written by Dr. Mohsin Khan, and the other one is on the state of the Arab transitions. And that was springboarded from our first regional event, which was a small but very high-level conference that we held in Tunisia to try and get the pulse of the Arab transitions, to find out what was happening. The upshot is, despite the fact that there has been uneven progress among the various countries, there is still a great deal of hope, and people are still insistent on their demands. Now, however, this event is not about what's happened. This event is not about the past. This event is taking a look at what we might expect to see going forward. So we're very, very lucky to have these three panelists, and I'll let you read their bios, but just very, very briefly. On my right, we have Mr. Yasser El Shimy, who was the Egypt analyst for the International Crisis Group, Cairo-based. He's also a former Egyptian diplomat. He's taught foreign policy at Catholic University, and he's currently a teaching fellow at BU. And he'll be talking about what political trends we might see in these four countries and on various themes that we might expect to see going on. On my left is Ms. Ellen Laipson, who has a quite bewilderingly impressive bio, but suffice to say that she has 25 years of government experience, and she sits on the Secretary of State's Foreign Policy Board. Now, and on my left is one of our own, Dr. Mohsin Khan, whose work at the Hariri Center is on the economic dimensions of the Arab uprisings. And he's honed that experience at various places, not the least of which the International Monetary Fund, where he headed the Middle East and Central Asia Department. So our speakers will be speaking for about 10 minutes, for exactly 10 minutes, and then we will open up the floor to discussion. Now, since there are a lot of you, I will do my best to take your questions in the order in which I see them. Please bear with me if I don't see you straight away. And again, because there are a lot of us today, if you could try and keep your questions or your comments to about a minute and a bit, so that we can get as engaging and fast a conversation as possible. All right, thank you. So we are going to start with
Okay.
Sorry, with Ellen.
Right.
Thank you, Mirette. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. It's a great topic, and I'm very glad we're going to try to look at the future. I was asked to try to put the Arab Spring in a more global context and see if we might draw some insights from other experiences in democratic transitions. And so one of our basic messages is please be patient. That these transitions don't happen in a 24-hour news cycle. They don't happen in a one-year cycle. They really are transformative change. Takes education. It takes institutional reform. It takes at least a decade in most cases. So I thought I would start with just hit a few points that The Economist made recently in a rather somber review of the state of democracy globally. So one more time, the Arab world has picked perhaps a poor timing, that this is not the most propitious moment for any part of the world to be trying to make democratic transitions, since the state of democracy globally is a little bit rocky right now. For The Economist, the peak of the democratization trend was in the early 90s, in the rapid fall of a number of autocrats. And by the year 2000, the Freedom House was saying that a pretty solid majority of the world's citizens and the number of states lived in free or partly free environments, even if viable democratic systems were not yet in place. So they were still in transition a full decade after that peak moment of the early 90s and the fall of the Soviet Union. But for The Economist, the year 2013 was the 8th consecutive year when global freedom was in decline. where we saw a contraction or an erosion of the quality of democracy, an erosion of the number of truly sustainable democratic systems that were in place. And certainly in the advanced democratic world of which we are a part, I think people could make a very strong argument that the quality of democracy, even though it is structurally in place, the quality of democracy leaves something to be desired. The general judgments of why this decline, the financial crisis, the rise of China, the aftermath of Iraq, and the crisis in Egypt, which we'll hear about a little bit later. And very briefly, their judgment was that the most successful democracies avoid majoritarianism, so that's a warning bell for the Iraq situation, and that some of the best democratic practices happen at the subnational level, that we see, whether it's town hall meetings or the ability of states within a federal system to introduce change, but at the national level, the quality of democracy is struggling. So this is the moment in which the Arab world had a spontaneous democratic moment, and we know that we're going to hear a little bit about the recent past and its various struggles. But I thought I would hit very, very briefly on 3 other non-Arab world transitions to try to glean a lesson or two. One is Ukraine. Its post-authoritarian moment was 1991, but its true revolution, the Orange Revolution, did not begin until 2004. Now, obviously, Ukraine is in another moment of crisis right now, but the point here is that the gap between authoritarianism and true political evolution and transformative change is not always, that gap can be wide, and countries can struggle with a backing and forth between the old system and a new system before it actually is consolidated and falls into place. Let me just quote the new Prime Minister of Tunisia, who made a statement that I thought echoed a little bit the point about Ukraine. In these last 3 years, we have not worked, we have not respected the institutions of the state, and we have not respected the law. We have not produced. That is not a revolution. Now, another revolution is beginning, that of our minds and our work. So in Tunisia, the outlier case, the most successful case, that 3-year period was a period of confusion and struggle, if you will. And for him, the revolution now begins. And the point about the Ukraine event is that the Ukraine story is that their revolution, the actual transformation of the mindset of citizens, of the institutions, in fact began more than a decade after the fall of communism and an autocratic system. The second example I wanted to give was on the Philippines. Philippines, their moment of transition happened with the fall of Marcos in 1986, and yet a full decade and a half later, the Philippines is described as a dysfunctional democracy. It has had problems of consolidating the democratic achievements of the early post-revolutionary period. And what are some of the issues? The role of the military is still contested. There is not yet total civilian control of the political system. There have not been final settlements of the struggles with communist and Muslim armed groups. The economy is in dire straits. There are still large inequalities. And that vibrant civil society, while it exists, some parts of civil society are themselves authoritarian and anti-democratic. The state is weak in terms of dealing with corruption. So I hope some of these points sound familiar to you. But that is a country that went through its democratic transition almost 30 years ago. And this is still the character of democracy in a country that we certainly categorize as democratic. There are elections. There is peaceful transfer of power. And yet these structural issues remain very important. And then very last example I wanted to briefly touch on was Argentina, where I have been intrigued, and others of you may know this story better, of how Argentina handled transitional justice and the gradual discrediting of the old elite. They did not do what we saw in Poland and Iraq, which was the very rapid and complete repudiation of the old elite, the mass disqualification of professional cadre that had operated in the old system. In the case of Argentina, they gradually, it was a 10-year process before being elected to the Senate or holding public office. The conditions kept changing so that eventually the people from the old system were no longer qualified to run. But they did not do it all in one fell swoop. So we learn examples from these other democratic experiences, but of course come back to the very humble realization that there isn't a perfect formula here. Different societies will have different impulses, and that for virtually all the countries in the last quarter century that have gone through these transitions, there have been ups and downs. So my final point, I guess, is, let me quote from Daniel Bell of Princeton, who took a very strong view on some of the analysis of the Arab Spring, sort of the unfairness of it, if you will. And he wrote, "It is unreasonable, even absurd, to expect revolutions to usher in stable representative democracies that respect human rights overnight. It is condescending and cruel," he said, "to scold countries for their failure to reproduce in 1 to 2 years what it took France, the US, and many others decades to achieve." My point is not to give the Arab world a pass here and say it's hard everywhere and therefore, of course, it's hard in the Arab world. I think we do need to be sensitive to a different era in which much greater transparency of information, much greater rapid expectation of change do put extra burdens on any society going through a democratic transition now. What we have learned in hindsight, and I'd welcome the views of the rest of the panel, is that social media isn't the magic formula for social transformation. That social media, in some cases, was a factor. In the Philippines early on, it was a positive factor for mobilization of people that had previously been apolitical. But it doesn't solve the problem. And social media, in some ways, is about empowering individuals, and that does not necessarily translate into respect for democratic institutions. And we have to accept that our culture, and certainly youth culture today, is very skeptical about formal institutions and processes. What they associate with freedom is individual freedom, not necessarily structural, societal, political processes of adjudicating conflict and determining what's in the general common good of society. Instead, people have been acculturated to look for what's good for them individually. And lastly, on the Arab world, I do have a very poignant sense that demography is a very heavy burden in the Arab world for getting to democracy by the same formula that other countries have done it. We do not see such stable, strong middle classes in many of the Arab countries in transition. If we think of the difference between the young people who are the democracy seekers in the Arab world and the actual base of society in Egypt, in Libya, in Yemen, we have to pause and say, do we have the preconditions for stable, sustainable democracy here? It's why Tunisia is such an interesting outlier. That Tunisia, the demography works more in their favor, and the fact that the political contest between a secular liberal vision of the state and a more Islamically oriented one, in Tunisia, I think what we are seeing is that it's a more even contest, whereas in other societies, we are seeing a big differential between the people who are looking to an Islamic form of democracy and those that may still favor a more permanent secular kind of democracy. So final point, time, it takes time. Reforming institutions or creating institutions from scratch takes time. This is also about changing people's attitudes about their own role in society and how do we develop values of citizenship. And I know that people in the Hariri Center and elsewhere are deeply interested in these issues. So thank you very much, Mirette.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. All right.
Shall we go?
Please.
All right. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And, as Mirette explained or introduced me earlier, I spent the last 3 years in Cairo, Egypt, which means I'm probably not going to give the most optimistic reading of the Arab Spring at this venue. But before I delve into the themes that I would like to talk about today, I want to just highlight a few points that I think are necessary as a prelude to any discussion of the Arab Spring, as the term had been coined. The first one is that what happened in 2011 was not necessarily a transition towards democracy. It was a political opening that happened as a result of popular and mass uprisings that took place across many different countries. and that had democracy as one of their goals, one of their aims, but was not the only goal or the only aim of these uprisings. So, we heard notions about dignity, about social justice, about equal opportunities. All of these themes were there. So, it is not entirely surprising, so to speak, to find that many people, here speaking especially about the case of Egypt, but this could also be replicated across many different countries, especially in Libya and to some extent in Yemen as well, to find people turning away from the democratic experiment, so to speak, because they perceive and feel and undergo serious deterioration in their living standards and in their living conditions. And this is, I think, one of the notions that we tend to overlook when we discuss the Arab Spring, which is that we tend to overemphasize the democratic dimensions of these transitions, and we also tend to overemphasize people's own commitment to having or establishing and maintaining a democratic system of government. So, there are many issues at stake, but at the end of the day, if you can't feed your children, if you can't send them to good schools, you're probably going to look back at the good old days where you could actually do these things. So that's just one issue I wanted to highlight. The other issue that I wanted to highlight also is, the usage of the term Arab Spring. It's quite problematic in itself because, again, it presumes that there will be a positive outcome, and that outcome is necessarily a democratic, prosperous system of government. And as we have seen across many countries that have undergone these revolutions, that has not necessarily been the case for a variety of reasons that we could get into later on. But the positive connotation is not necessarily there. So as I said, there was a political opening that happened, but that does not necessarily denote a particular outcome. The other issue is, I'm not sure that Egypt necessarily belongs in the same category as Libya, Yemen, and Tunisia right now. Is Egypt perhaps, better positioned with Syria and Bahrain at this moment? I think that's one issue that we need to actually look into. My inclination is to say that there is no such thing as a democratic transition taking place in Egypt right now. You could have elections, you could have referendums, all the procedural aspects of a democratic system, but that does not in any way indicate a profound, real transformation of the political system into a more democratic one. Even the pluralistic dimensions of that particular system of government that we saw after 2011 and we saw with the parliamentary elections and the presidential elections in Egypt, those have been undone. And they are unlikely to be revived in the foreseeable future. So we need to be very aware of those points. So when it comes to the future of political Islam in the region and in the Middle East, I would say that actually the future of political Islam is not just determined within the Arab Spring countries. It might actually be decided as well in the non-Arab Spring countries. So countries such as the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and even Morocco. All of these countries have their own Islamist movements that operate within them and that are striving to make their voices heard and striving to effect certain changes, but whose role has obviously been dealt a huge blow following the ouster of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. One general statement I would say about the future of political Islam is that Islamists are down but not out. So they have indeed been dealt a great blow, especially in Egypt, but even now increasingly across the region, especially in the Gulf. But in Egypt, for example, where they've been suppressed to really unprecedented levels. I think that they are likely to continue to play a game of spoilers, where they are going to try and undermine the military-backed system that is being established right now. And they're going to do that through mass mobilization, continued mass mobilization, and other acts of defiance, encouraging strikes, and so on. And the way they see it, and the way that I would say even the military sees it, that this is a zero-sum game. Somebody has to be a winner, the other has to be a loser. I don't see any negotiation, any negotiated compromise taking place in the foreseeable future or even the medium term. What is likely to continue to be the case is that Egypt will continue to go through the pattern of confrontational, exclusionary politics that has pretty much characterized the entire actually transitional period since 2011, but now has taken further vigor, if you will, and has taken further dimension of violence, obviously acts of terrorism, and just really jarring levels of state repression. But the Egypt example or the Egypt model may have actually saved Islam elsewhere. And we've seen the cases of, in Tunisia in particular, where, the Islamist government voluntarily or, under some pressure, agreed to basically step down and form a coalition government. And opted for a more consensual approach towards politics. And I think that's definitely one thing that has been missing from the transitions that have ensued throughout the Arab Spring countries. The pattern from the get-go has been to just jump into elections. Okay, thanks. Jump into elections. And whoever wins gets it all. Obviously, that is a deeply flawed approach, and in retrospect, we can say that, but one that has obviously led to disastrous results in Egypt. And I think the model that is more likely to prove enduring is one where a negotiated pact or a pacted transition has taken place, and that's especially the case in Yemen, and to also a great extent in Tunisia. Right. I wanted to just touch very briefly on a couple other points. The first one is that in the future, as we go along, we are likely to encounter a few themes. The first one is that the state is going to have its authority and power diminished. In fact, that's already the case. The state's ability to not just enforce the law, but to just be present in people's lives is very much in question. Its ability to provide goods and services to populations that are growing in need is likely to be further curtailed as a result of the sociopolitical instability. And that's going to catch some of these countries in the very unfortunate vicious cycle of economic underperformance and sociopolitical turmoil, each fueling the other. And it will take a lot of, I think, international help to get these countries out of this, being caught in this tailspin, if you will. Another theme, I think, is that the center, as I said, the major urban centers are going to have their ability to influence politics in their countries further curtailed. And that is because the periphery in these countries, as in the mostly rural, impoverished populations of these countries are growing in numbers and in need, and they're becoming much more vocal about demanding their fair share of the spoils here. So it was no coincidence, for example, that in Tunisia, the revolution actually started in the impoverished rural side. And in Egypt, to a great extent, that's also happening to be the case, where outside of Cairo, you're seeing a lot of the mobilization that's currently taking place. And in a way, one could look at what has been happening again in Egypt as this battle between urban-based elites, wanting to maintain their privileges that they've held for 6 decades at least, as opposed to people from the countryside who are rising or trying to challenge some of those prerogatives. I'm going to stop here because I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. We will actually continue this in the questions, so thank you very much. And since none of this really takes shape without the economic dimensions, can we please ask Mohsin to weigh in?
Well, thank you very much, Mirette. Okay, basically I'd like to start with just very briefly talk about the last 3 years, even though we're supposed to be looking forward, just as a backdrop to what I'm going to talk about in terms of the future. First of all, I mean, it's very clear all 4 of the economies floundered in the wake of the Arab uprising. It's, in a sense, both domestic shocks, political primarily, as well as external European financial crisis, etc., oil prices, they all sort of combined to create almost a perfect storm for these countries at a time. So what was the outcome of this storm? Well, growth collapsed virtually everywhere. And growth is very important because one of the factors that led to the uprising was the fact that people wanted jobs, and basically growth became central. So you had cases where in 2011, both Yemen and Tunisia had an actual recession, which is hardly ever seen in the developing world. I mean, they had negative rates of growth. Libya, of course, fell off the cliff, but that had a lot to do with the oil production, drop in oil production. And Egypt was growing in 2011 at less than 2%. Unemployment, which was, as I said, the major factor a main factor in the uprising, rose in all of these countries. External balances weakened in all of these countries. Egypt lost within a couple of years, more than half of its international reserves. More than half, actually. And so that basically was a consequence of this perfect storm. But over the 3 years, so that was the first initial shock that these countries had in 2011. It continued on to 2012, 2013, and you may ask why. Well, my view is that, and the views of others is the countries had no coherent economic plan. The politicians and the governments were not paying attention to the economy. They were totally absorbed in the political situation, political/security situation. So nobody was paying any attention to what's going on in the economy, even though economic factors were so important in the initial uprising. The Arab countries, and here I'll just follow on from what Ellen was saying, the Arab countries, actually, the Arab Spring countries, lacked an economic model, which the transition countries of Eastern Europe and Eastern Central Europe had. They could aspire to join the European Union, so they had a model to which to aspire to. The Arab countries had no such model, particularly since the previous model had been discredited. The so-called neoliberal model had been highly discredited, and you had no model there easily available for you. So what did you do? Well, you had to cater to the population's demands for a better life and so on, so they engaged in populist policies. Completely understandable. They maintained and increased subsidies, but subsidies are very high in the region. Egypt, 10% of its GDP goes in food and energy subsidies. In Libya, 14% of it goes in subsidies. They maintain that. They increase government employment, because you can't create jobs out of thin air. You want to give people jobs. There's only one agency in a country that can create jobs overnight, and that's the government. So you had 400,000 workers going in the first year and a half in Egypt, employed by the government. In Tunisia, you had 26,000 workers employed in government. So you engaged in populist policies of that kind. You had wage increases, minimum wage increases, and so on. The final thing that I would say is that, I mean, the countries also expected a significant amount of financing. In the heady days of the post-Arab Spring, you had the Deauville Partnership, which was convened, and they said that these countries will get $40 billion, etc. Hardly any of that came through the Deauville group. US-EU financing was minuscule. Now, the Deauville Partnership was important because the Deauville Partnership said that, you know, you will receive this money if you follow, in quotes, appropriate economic policies, which for someone like me is just a code word for saying you have IMF programs. None of those countries until 2013 had an IMF program. So the Deauville Partnership did not actually deliver any money via the Deauville Partnership. That's not to say financing didn't come. Financing did, and it came from the Gulf countries primarily. And the Gulf money had no such economic conditionality. It didn't say, we'll give you this money if you engage in these reforms or if you engage in this restructuring of your economies. That was entirely political, and we all know that. So that's the backdrop of what's been going on with the mess of the last 3 years. What happens in 2014, now looking forward? Well, I think that one can safely say that the decline has been arrested. That's not to say very much, but the decline has certainly been arrested. And there are some signs of a turnaround, but the turnaround that we're talking about is a weak turnaround. I'll tell you, in the good thing that has happened, and you know, Tunisia is used as an example, as in this case. So Tunisia has an IMF program, and it is engaged in some reforms, etc. So there is evidence of some turnaround there. In the case of Egypt, it's stabilized at a low level. Things have stabilized at a very low level. In Libya, we're facing another collapse, simply again because oil production is offline. So, and Yemen is just limping along. That's what however, things are not getting worse. And so I think that if there's going to be any optimism, you have to think about what's going to happen in the next year or two, and then what's going to happen even further out in the next 4 or 5 years. And in the next year or two, I think there are good signs that things will turn around. Well, it doesn't mean that you will get back to a roaring rate of growth that will create enough jobs to employ the people coming on, the young people coming on to the labor force. But you'll get to some positive signs of growth picking up, unemployment falling, your external balance is improving, inflation coming down. These are sort of macro indicators that I think will show up. The trick, of course, is that you need to get growth going. So you can engage in austerity, to fix your public finances or to achieve a better balance of payments position and so on. But how do you get growth going at the same time? And for that, I think is going to be the major issue for the countries. In the short run, I don't believe it's that difficult to get growth going in these countries in the next year or two. And the reason for that is that in most of these countries, what has happened, of course, is the uprising and the negative economic impacts of the uprising has led to an acute shortage of energy in Egypt, for example, shortages of inputs, particularly imported inputs for countries that have balance of payments problems, and it's led to a lot of labor problem issues that are related to the political side, but are there. I believe that if you can sort out the energy and problems, of course, all this has led to a serious lack of capacity utilization. In other words, there is tremendous excess capacity in the manufacturing sector in these countries, possibly as much as 50%. So what we need to do is see if everyone talks about we've got to invest in order to get growth going. I think that that's right. For the long run, undoubtedly true. But I don't think that that's that important for the 1 or 2 years that I'm looking at, which is 2014, 2015. You can get growth going with the existing capital stock. Because remember that these countries were growing at those rates of 5, 6, 7% with the current capital stock. What they have a problem with is utilization of that capital stock. So that's what I'm going to be pushing. And I think the other positive sign is that, as I said, Tunisia has an IMF program, so they have a coherent economic program. It's very likely that Yemen will have one soon, and that'll be a good. There's been a lot of talk about Egypt. It's possible that Egypt will have an IMF program. Libya won't have an IMF program as such because it has the financial resources, etc. But it may have something like what is called a precautionary program, like for example, Morocco has currently. But I'll end with saying, I mean, that's the sort of reasons for my optimism for the next year or two. It can be done. What is more difficult is when people get into talking about the future of major economic reforms, those are going to be difficult. Not only are people talking about major economic, they're talking about creating new institutions, revamping institutions and legal frameworks and labor laws and investment and business regulations, etc. These are going to take a lot of time. And I think the results of which are going to show up 10 years from now. I'll end with what I'll echo Ellen on this thing. Will people be patient enough to wait for that? Or are we likely to see perhaps, and I actually end my paper with that line, is you could have another uprising if people are not seeing the results from they're not sufficiently patient to wait 5 or 10 years for the results to show up. Thank you, Mirette.
Well, that was fast. Okay, so I'm going to use actually, since there are questions, I will ask a question later. All right. So, all right, there's one over there. I'm actually going to use my moderator's privilege to ask one very quick question. To start off with, Yasser, on the intersection between politics and economics. Now, you mentioned that in many cases this was, on some level, a struggle between urban elites attempting to hang on to the privileges that they'd gained over 6 decades, and rural, not-so elites demanding their rights. Now, on the off chance that these countries, whichever of them you think, may get their economic acts together, and considering that they had previously functioned on an authoritarian bargain model, if they get their economic acts together and if there is food on the table, what do you think that any chances towards democratization might be derailed?
Well, I mean, that's a big if. I do not share the optimism regarding the economic prospects of many of these countries, but especially in the Egyptian case. I think it's more likely that we will see further economic deterioration, actually, and one that's going to impose even greater strains on the society's abilities to handle this kind of economic turmoil. But assuming that the economic situation does improve, that could actually not be a bad thing for the prospects of democratization, because at least in the many of the cases that have gone through successful democratic transformations, there was usually a prerequisite of a pretty robust middle class that believed firmly in the need for a democratic system of government. That may have been the case initially in 2011 in Egypt. That's not necessarily the case right now, as a result of two things. First, that the middle class itself in Egypt has diminished greatly as a result of very high levels of inflation that have been unsustainably high for at least the past 10 years. And also the fact that unemployment has been rising, and especially unemployment amongst highly educated university graduates from the middle class, most likely. So, you know, I think that, yes, will be a good thing for democratization. I'm not sure it's going to be there.
All right, thank you. So the first question was, if we manage to get a mic to you, could you please just introduce yourself when you ask the question? So Khalil, over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Khalil Anani from Johns Hopkins University. I have 2 points, one for Ellen, one for Yasser. The first one for Ellen is about building on other regional experiences that you mentioned about Argentina and Ukraine. To what extent do you think that regional forces can play a role in impeding, on hindering transition? To be specific, to what extent Saudi Arabia and Emirates can hinder transition in Egypt towards democracy? To what extent they can still support the country regime in Egypt, and to what extent this can succeed or not? The question for Yasser is about the Sisi himself, which I think is running for presidency, no doubt about this. But the question is, to what extent he can be able to run the country given this economic and social conditions, and to what extent his running for presidency might put the army under more public scrutiny and can affect negatively on its image. Thank you.
Well, I think the inter-Arab politics that are going on right now are really quite fascinating to watch, about who has leverage on whom, or whether each country is insisting on saying, you know, we have our own national identity, we have our own national destiny to fulfill, and whether they can a little bit resist some of the pressures from the larger or wealthier Arab countries. I do think that the Gulf countries are very purposefully trying to create disincentives to go all the way to democracy. I think that is their objective. They are saying stability matters more, we will help you with your economy, but please, please don't go down this naive path of thinking that, you know, complete freedom in the Western model is appropriate or suitable for Arab culture. So there is a very tough conversation going on about, now it seems to me that Egypt has made a choice, at least temporarily, that it very much agrees with the Gulf view. But I do think this is a conversation that doesn't end, and whether the Gulf countries believe that they can impose a political model on. In the past, they would never have had such confidence or ambition to think that they could impose a political model on a country like Egypt. That would just have been beyond their reach. Has that shifted? Has the sort of power center, the center of gravity in Arab world politics shifted so that the Gulf countries are now more important in setting the agenda for the rest of the region? I think that's something we'll all be watching. Yeah. Excuse? Remains to be seen. Yeah. I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that Arab societies believe they have distinct characteristics and will want to pursue each national story on its own right.
So I think there are two parts to your question. The first one is whether or not Field Marshal Sisi is going to be able to govern the country effectively, and the second part is about the role of the army moving forward, and civil-military relations in general, if I understand correctly. For the first part, I think it's, you know, Egypt is very much flirting with the situation of becoming virtually ungovernable. You're talking about a country of almost 90 million people, about 40% of whom live under the poverty line. As I said, unsustainably high levels of inflation, extremely high levels of unemployment, especially among the young people, almost 40% or higher unemployment levels. Bearing in mind that over 60% of Egypt's population is under 35 years old. We're talking about crumbling infrastructure that requires tens of billions of dollars of investment to just rejuvenate. We're talking about a crumbling healthcare system, a crumbling educational system. There's just, you know, and even the traditional sources of government revenue are completely collapsing. So tourism, for example, which used to contribute almost up to 10% or so of GDP, just year over year, 2013 as compared to 2012, is down by almost 65%, and that was before the latest terrorist attacks that happened in the Sinai, and even the kind of tourists who actually come to Egypt are not the kinds of tourists who used to come to Egypt, i.e., affluent Western tourists. We're now seeing tourists from other nationalities that may not pay as much and who only come because great discounts are made. But anyway, the larger point here is that the economic situation is very dire. The ability of the state to maintain order, so to speak, is dependent on its continued use of extreme forms of violence. And that is what has happened in Egypt since last July, but it is also highly unsustainable over the long term. Not just because of the practical ability of the state bodies to maintain this level of violence, but also because this has, again, dire economic consequences and political consequences as well, because the harsher the state's treatment of protesters or dissidents is, the more likely these dissidents are to resort to violence themselves, and we've already been seeing radicalization throughout the board in Egypt, and therefore the further chances of terrorism and other forms of violence, and therefore the worse economic picture. So it's as I said, it's a bit of a vicious cycle that will require Herculean effort to escape. I think the other part of the question about the future of the army and whether or not it's going to come under civilian scrutiny, I think we know the answer to that. I mean, it's not happening anytime soon. The military has a very strong belief that it is the only patriotic body in Egypt, and it is the one that is acting to maintain national security and national interests, and whatever sacrifices have to be made towards that effect will have to be made, and they don't trust civilians. They cannot accept the idea of having civilian oversight. And I mean, we have seen that even at a time when the military was open to the idea of having a semi or pseudo-democratic system in the country, it still was very defensive about its prerogatives, about its interests, and obviously very firm against any attempt by the civilians to oversee its business. So that is very unlikely to change in the foreseeable future.
Lady over there in the back.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Lily Lusada. I'm with the Center for American Progress. My question is mostly for you, Ellen, although I welcome all of your commentary. I'm wondering in specific terms, you articulated the great need and difficulty therein of kind of good governance and institution developments in these countries. What is the role, if any, that the U.S. can play in encouraging and supporting that sort of development? Thank you.
Well, I think this is a moment of some humble reflection in the part of the U.S. system that believes very deeply in engagement with civil society, and that we can be, in appropriate ways, an agent of change in these societies. I think I think the Egypt case could not be more stark of the discrediting, if you will, at least by the regime, of this major component of American engagement with Egyptian society. So I think this is a period of retrenchment and reflection. I had thought at one time what we might consider doing is de-Americanizing it a bit, so that you might have a UNDP office in which both European and American NGOs could operate in a kind of collective way, so that it wasn't seen quite so aggressively as an American intervention. But I think that the moment has passed, and I think conditions are worse. Again, you have outliers. You have Yemen and Tunisia, I think, still very receptive to American support to building up civil society. But just as, public democratic institutions are discredited, let's be clear here, civil society isn't always seen as the benign actor or as the somehow representing the perfect good of what the society's collective interest is. There is a little bit of a backlash against NGOs and civil society more broadly, not just the Western imported ones, but even locally. Who elected you? Why do you believe that you represent somehow, or that you are better positioned to decide what's good for our country, et cetera? So, I also think that this is, again, part of the education of citizens who in the past were not empowered. They need to, be part of that process of learning what are the parameters or the boundaries of civil society engagement. But, look, I think that to some extent the official American system continues, we believe in scholarships, we believe in engaging, et cetera, and the big machine keeps working on these programs, but to me the political environment in which they're operating is much rougher and tougher than it used to be, and in some countries we're just not welcome anymore. So I think this is a period of adjustment. I think in the end it will swing back again, and this is, I believe, a global process that exists, that civil society to civil society engagement, independent of what governments may prefer or what governments wish to control, is happening everywhere, and it will continue to happen. But I think we're in a rough patch right now. And I don't know whether there are some who represent some of those programmatic activities that have a view that maybe things are slightly getting better. I don't know. But again, it's different in each country. Egypt is the hardest case right now.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Donnie?
Thank you all for a great panel. Danya Greenfield with the Atlantic Council. I have two questions. One, I wanted to dig a little bit at this economic issue since this is a central theme and obviously a point of debate. And it seems clear that in several of the cases in these countries, one could see improvement on the macroeconomic indicators, that you could have an IMF agreement and funds flowing in and the currency stabilized, and yet still not see an improvement in the day-to-day living conditions of the majority of the population, so that both what you're predicting may in fact happen and what Yasser noted, which is potential deterioration continuing, could also happen. And so, and I'm also reminded of this sort of discrediting of the liberal economic model where indicators in Egypt were on the rise and things were looking relatively good in the years prior to the uprising, and yet people's experience of what was happening was increasing economic inequality, further disparity between the wealthy elite and the sort of average population. And so I'm wondering if that would be likely to happen again, where IMF agreements might come in, the macroeconomic indicators are improving, and yet people's experience of their economic day-to-day life actually continues to deteriorate. That unemployment isn't really addressed in any deep structural way. So I'm interested to hear actually both of your thoughts on the sort of the trickle-down potential and how these governments are going to deal with those kinds of challenges. And on a totally separate note, a question for Ellen. I was struck by your example of the Philippines, a country about which I know absolutely nothing. But I'm wondering if there are some reflections you have of the ability for some of the major issues to still be serious stumbling blocks in terms of the role of the military, and yet the perception, at least, and maybe in reality, continuing evolution towards deeper democracy, and whether or not there's almost two levels of institutional development, where some things are stuck and in other planes they're moving forward, and what that might portend for a country like Egypt or elsewhere. Thanks.
I think it's perfectly fair to say that having an IMF program is necessary but not sufficient for stabilizing and getting growth going. I think the reason I mentioned the why I'm optimistic because they have IMF programs is there is an economic plan in place. Right until without that, there hasn't been. And so there is some at least objectives, even if they may be limited to the macro side, and there's some policies that are being undertaken to achieve those objectives. But what I think is going to happen in the short run with an IMF program is that there will be a growth spurt in these countries, for sure. The reason is not the IMF program. The reason is the financing that the IMF program will open up. The financing that has already been committed, the financing that is waiting for these countries, ostensibly until they have an IMF program. So I think that having an IMF program will generate financing and will generate resources for the countries themselves. There are also other reasons for optimism because the Gulf Arabs have promised a lot of money to countries like Egypt and to Yemen, for that matter, and they are promising more. The question is, what is this money going to be used for? And I think it's going to be used precisely through the fiscal stimulus to address the kind of weaknesses that Yasser was talking about, which is the infrastructure problems, which is projects, which are all designed to create jobs. Now, that's not to say that inequalities will reduce. That's a very tough one to handle. I'm just saying that I'm optimistic in the next year or two that this is, of course, cannot be sustained because this money won't keep coming forever. But it can kickstart the economy back, the economies back. And I think that will be, whether it will be sustained or not will depend on whether the countries then engage or undertake these major structural reforms that they need to. They may not, in which case you might get a reversal. But I think I was talking mainly about the next year or two, and I'm much more optimistic about the next year or two, which if you believe the numbers around, for example, if you think that the UAE right now is planning a $40 billion Marshall Plan for the next 2-3 years for Egypt, in projects, etc., that's going to be a big boost for the country. So you will get positive results. I agree that it's not going to help. It's not necessarily going to reduce income inequalities. But it will create growth and it will create jobs.
So, I don't have a lot of information about what future allocations of money that the Gulf countries could provide for Egypt, but what I can speak about is the money that has already been given. And that is anywhere between $12 to $18 billion since last July. And where did this money go? It went mostly into subsidies for energy, food. It went into propping up the foreign currency reserves and therefore stabilizing the currency. It went also into paying off foreign debt that the Egyptian government owes. So in other words, it has been dedicated to a lot of items on the fiscal side of things that are keeping Cairo basically afloat, that is preventing Egypt from going bankrupt, essentially. So it has had a remarkably little impact on the real economy, where not just the tourism sector, which I had spoken about earlier, suffers a great deal, and that is a big employer of Egyptians, but also we've had at least, or about 1,000 factory closures since last July in Egypt. We have had an unprecedented wave of labor strikes throughout various professions throughout the country. So, it has had, as I said, a remarkably little effect on the real economy. And I'm not entirely optimistic about that changing per se, because I imagine that a lot of the new money that's going to come to Egypt will also be needed to be directed towards energy subsidies, towards on some of these other fiscal issues, because otherwise Egypt is going to struggle to pay its bills, essentially.
Very much agree with the premise of your question, which is that different parts of reform will happen at different rates and different speeds. And so you could be moving quickly in one category, but seeing a lag in another category. and that there isn't a perfect rhythm to these things. And some of it does depend on whether there's local ownership, whether there's a local champion, whether there's a political figure that is charismatic and persuades larger segments of the old elite that change is a good thing. I mean, in each case, it happens very differently. But it did remind me to just say a word about security and to connect it to the previous question to me. It does seem to me that even people who perceive themselves as Democrats and who want to be part of a democratic transition, in the end, they still care about security in terms of law and order, and so that some of the slipping backwards that has happened in countries in transition is that when you've dismantled your infrastructure too much and there's suddenly this period of chaos, people lose their confidence in change and they want to go back to the old order where there's some greater guarantee of day-to-day security. And so that they can be holding both thoughts at the same time, that yes, they want peaceful political change and they still want some parts of the old system to still function because it's scary without them. And then the point about American engagement is it does, there's been lots of smart, interesting work about security sector reform, community policing. How do you change the relationship between society and the security forces in a previously non-democratic country? How do you get citizens to trust the state? Lots of creative and important work has been done. But it really works when it's initiated by the community itself or by the society itself. And so that we can bring in these good ideas, but sometimes it's a one-off, we fund it for a couple of years and then we go away. The trick to the real transition is when it's starting to happen from the society and the state itself, where they really buy into it and want to sustain it themselves.
William Zartman from SAIS. I want to rise to a quick defense of the term Arab Spring. As everybody knows, spring is not a permanent feature. Seasons succeed themselves, and spring's not going to last even in California. So I think it suggests that we should look at things in dynamic terms and underscores what Ellen is saying, that we're in for the long haul and there will be ups and downs. But my question is about revolution. The term has been bandied about here, and again, I think it's incontrovertible that we've had no revolution in any of these countries, pace the Tunisians, who like the term. That is, there's been, in the classical sense, there's been no social upheaval bringing in a different caste, the bottom that pushes the top aside and rules. But there's been a big political change, maybe a political revolution. What are the chances, or what are the possibilities of having a deeper revolution out of this situation for which the Arab Spring is just the beginning?
Would all three of you like to take that? Can we start with Ellen, please? Yes.
I quite agree that these are not, deep revolutionary movements, that Egypt in the end was kind of an urban, educated phenomenon. Tunisia was a little deep, in terms of the percent of the population that participated. I think Tunisia was a little bit closer, but it was, for the most part, middle-class society saying we want more freedom. When I look at the demography of the Middle East, I don't think there is revolutionary fervor. I think that these changes, and I appreciated Yasser saying right at the beginning, let's not assume that we're talking about democratization in all cases. We may be talking about varying kinds of reform or structural change or improvement in representativeness, et cetera. We're not everybody's embracing democracy as the end goal. So I take the point that we should be careful about overusing revolution when it doesn't quite meet that threshold.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, just one small note on this. I would say that perhaps the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was uniquely positioned to play that role, to actually try and mobilize the lower classes, I guess, of Egyptian society. And in many ways, it represents, many people, especially lower middle class and lower class Egyptians in the countryside. But due to the nature of the organization itself as a very, closed organization, a secret society almost, it has failed to to perhaps mobilize the larger masses, but that has not stopped its detractors, the movement's detractors, from casting it as representing that class, and therefore becoming very apprehensive and very nervous about the rise of that particular class of Egyptians into political prominence, and therefore reacting to it in very defensive ways.
This discussion has been entirely about 5 countries. Two-part question. The first one is, do you see the infection spreading? And if so, how will this affect the larger Arab world? And secondly, does Saudi Arabia and the UAE's recent actions indicate a certain amount of lack of self-confidence about their own stability?
Is that for anyone in particular, or could we? Anybody. Can we start with Ellen, please?
So I do think that the moderate monarchies have felt some pressure. If we look at Morocco and Jordan, as compared to the Gulf, countries that are not resource rich and who maybe identify a little bit more with the Mediterranean Arab countries, they have felt obliged to embrace at least some of the vocabulary of reform and change. How deep is it? I'm a little bit skeptical, but I think they are listening to the mood in their citizenry, and they don't want to miss what may still be seen as having captured the imagination of young people in a positive way. So I think they may want to be part of it. But you are an expert on the part of the Arab world that really says hell no, that says, you know, we just don't think that model is in our interest at all, and let's just not go there. And what can we do to knock some sense into the other Arab countries who somehow got caught up on this wave and think that this is, you know. So I think there is a split in thinking among Arab leaders, and it would be kind of fascinating to hear what happens when they get together, of how much the distrust that we have had in past periods of Arab world history, whether between the Arab nationalists and the more traditional societies, et cetera, it has to be as acute today as it's ever been, of them really believing that some of their Arab counterparts are just really going down the wrong road. So, but in terms of spreading, look, I think that the enthusiasm and the romance of the Arab Spring is over. I mean, not necessarily permanently over, but I think it's hard to argue that the momentum is still there. I think that we're in a very different historic moment. So I don't see it. I think among parts of youth culture and parts of cosmopolitan elites, there is a strong hope that there's an inevitability to change. That if we think of this as generational, that when we look back 20 years from now, we will realize that really this was a turning point historically. So I think there is still embedded in some constituencies a belief that this is a long-term and inevitable and highly desirable process of change. But I think that we have to be honest that that's not a universal demand in the Arab world, and it's not a universal dynamic in how state-society relations are playing out, including in some of the most currently powerful Arab countries. We have a strange situation where Egypt, the great capitals, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, in a strange way, Baghdad is looking, more promising than some of the other historic Arab capitals. Who leads? Who decides what the next chapter of Arab history is going to look like? So that's as much as I can say. I don't know.
Thank you. Just briefly.
Okay. I think it's a period of time where you're going to have a region that has no clear leadership, so to speak. There's very much a diffusion of power. I think that the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates would not be pouring billions of dollars to support counter-revolutions and coups throughout the region had it not been for them feeling extremely insecure about their own situations. And the escalatory measures that they have resorted to recently, including labeling the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization and expelling the Qatari ambassadors, withdrawing their ambassadors from Doha. All of these measures reflect a real nervousness, especially in a country like Saudi Arabia, where succession is just around the corner.
Thank you, all of you. I'm Faisal Aitani with the Atlantic Council's Hariri Center. I guess my question is directed at Yasser and Mohsin. If the IMF does come through with a program for Egypt, what is the impact of the security situation there, assuming it continues at its current level, on sources of capital, including domestic and international? And what are investors' thresholds for investing, and how much insecurity can they stomach?
I think that it's a very good point, and basically, and that's why in the next couple of years, I was not sort of thinking, I'm not putting too much stock in foreign investment coming in and helping out these countries. It's going to be primarily, if there is foreign investment, it'll be foreign investment coming from the Gulf. On the other hand, Faisal, I mean, investors do the risk-return kind of calculations. And if the returns are sufficiently high enough, then they will invest. The IMF program is not really designed to encourage foreign investors. It's an important signal to foreign investors that this country has got an economic plan, or it's got its economic house in order. But they're going to make that calculation on a risk-return basis. And I think that if foreign investors it depends on where the foreign investment is coming from. From the Gulf, it will come, and it'll come. From Lebanon, it will come. Within the region. Whether Europeans and Americans will be investing in Egypt in the near term, that remains to be seen.
I would say that perhaps Tunisia could be the only case that actually shows some promise when it comes to foreign direct investment, because unlike Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, Tunisia perhaps might be the only case where there's not just the promise of a functioning political process, but also the central authorities' ability to maintain law and order is pretty much well established, to some, relatively speaking, compared to those other countries.
Thank you. My name is Thinelli. I'm an intern here at the Atlantic Council, and I have a question. Like, we're talking about democracy, military security, which is a carnivore of fancy words, but with a population that is like deeply haunted by poverty. I wonder if anyone looks at a rural area to look at agriculture, to design a plan to really to solve the problem of poverty first. And I wonder if there's any like potential leaderships to have this willpower and political like ally to really make a change of like stop saying those ideological, very fancy thing and start doing real work. Thank you.
I'd ask you to answer that because it played into something that you answered earlier. So.
Sure. I mean, it's the question of providing for those who are most in need. In the Egyptian case, that's just simply not on the agenda. I mean, not of the Muslim Brotherhood, not of the military, and not of the other political actors. I'm afraid the political actors have just been enmeshed in this struggle for power over the past 3 years, where they have just completely overlooked the actual and real needs of those who are most vulnerable in society. And that's, again, unfortunately, unlikely to change.
We have time for 2 very quick questions. How about here, please? Just there and there.
Mohammed El-Minshawi from Egyptian Ashruk and the Middle East Institute. My question is, what if we have a new military officer who is a president in Egypt like Abdel Fattah al-Sisi? Will it mean more scrutiny from the public for the military and the army affairs, or will be more imposing red lines for this black box of the army in Egypt?
I think we answered very, very briefly because you answered this earlier.
Sure.
1 minute.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that it's actually going to be paradoxical in the sense that people are going to start associating the military increasingly with their own livelihoods, with their affairs of government. And they are going to probably increasingly demand greater accountability on the part of the military. But there's a different part to this, which is whether or not the military is willing to provide that. And my intuition is that it's very unlikely to want to play along in the foreseeable future unless some actual real pressure is imposed on it.
Thank you. And our final question over here, sir.
From the IMF, former deputy of Mohsin. Let me ask about Egypt. Let's say that Mohsin's scenario turns out to be okay. There's assistance, the IMF program, European Union. Democracy, to me, has a very dark future in Egypt right now. I think the fix is in to go back to the Mubarak type of regime supported by the military. And that might work for 3 or 4 years, but at the end of the road, they're going to be facing the same fundamental economic policy issues. Could we see another round of revolution or pricing? I mean, I'm completely wrong that democracy, the future of democracy is very dark right now in Egypt?
Can I just make one point?
Please.
I'm not going to address whether the future of democracy is dark or not. I think the issue that I'm concerned about, Lorenzo, in Egypt and on the economic side is will Field Marshal Sisi and the new government go back to Hosni Mubarak of the post-2004, or will it go further back to a complete status kind of situation? And right now, it's not clear at all to me what kind of economic regime will emerge with the new, if you like, military-supported government. And it's going to make a big difference to the economy and at that point.
So the thing about counter-revolutions or coups is that usually a return to the status quo ante is not sufficient. Right? They cannot return to the way that it was under Mubarak. They have to go further, as in they have to be more oppressive. And that's usually not a very conducive environment for economic development, especially when you have a regime in power whose legitimacy is in question, where you have incredibly and potentially unprecedented levels of societal polarization in Egypt. And not to mention any regime will have to make its choices very, very quickly about income distribution, the rich and the poor, issues such as the minimum wage, but also issues such as pervasive corruption in the state bureaucracy, the fact that it's also bloated and the fact that it needs to be trimmed down, energy subsidies, food subsidies. All of these questions are going to have to be addressed head on, and unless there is an inclusive program that provides some rigorous safety nets to those who are most vulnerable in the population, we are likely to see more socio-political turmoil in the country moving forward.
All right, thank you. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap up very quickly. I think apparently the clearest thing is that we don't have an enormous amount of clarity, but we are in for a very long haul. I would like to thank our panelists, Ms. Ellen Laipson, Mr. Yasser El Shimy, Dr. Mohsin Khan. Thank you very much. I would encourage you to read the reports. They're on the website. And thank you very, very much for coming.